Have you ever looked in the mirror and wondered how you became a stranger to yourself? How someone who once laughed freely, who once believed in her own worth, could become someone who whispers apologies for existing? Tonight, I want to share with you the story of Sarah, a 37-year-old woman from Phoenix, Arizona, whose journey through the darkest valleys of emotional manipulation led her to discover a strength she never knew she possessed. This is more than just a story about a toxic relationship. This is about the invisible chains we sometimes allow others to place around our hearts, and the moment we finally remember, we hold the key. Sarah had always been the kind of person who saw the best in people. Growing up in a small neighborhood where everyone knew each other, she learned early that kindness was a currency that never lost its value. Her mother, a nurse who worked double shifts to support the family after her father left when Sarah was 12, had taught her that loving others meant putting their needs first. It was a lesson that would shape Sarah's life in ways she never anticipated, creating both her greatest strength and her most vulnerable weakness. By the time Sarah reached her mid-30s, she had built what appeared to be a successful life. She worked as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized company, owned her own small apartment, and maintained friendships that had lasted since college. But underneath this carefully constructed exterior, something fundamental had shifted. The woman who once spoke up in meetings had learned to stay quiet. The woman who once trusted her instincts had begun questioning every thought that crossed her mind. The woman who once believed she deserved love had somehow accepted that maybe she was too much, too sensitive, too difficult to truly be loved. The transformation had been so gradual that Sarah herself hadn't noticed it happening. Like watching your hair grow or seasons changing, the shift occurred in increments so small that each day felt normal, even as the accumulation of those days had led her somewhere she never intended to go. It started 3 years earlier when she met Marcus at a coffee shop downtown. He was charming in that confident way that drew people like moths to a flame. He remembered her coffee order after their second meeting, sent her thoughtful texts throughout the day, and had a way of making her feel like she was the most fascinating woman in the room when they were together. In those early months, Sarah felt like she had finally found someone who truly saw her, who appreciated the depth of her thoughts and the gentleness of her spirit. Marcus would tell her she was different from other women, more intelligent, more understanding, more worth his time. At first, these comments made her feel special, chosen, elevated above the ordinary experiences of her past relationships. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the compliments began to carry undertones that Sarah couldn't quite identify. When Marcus told her she was smarter than most women, there was an implicit suggestion that most women were somehow lesser. When he praised her for being understanding, it came with the expectation that she would understand why he needed to make decisions for both of them. When he called her special, it was often in moments when he was explaining why the rules that applied to other people didn't apply to him. Sarah found herself making small accommodations, tiny adjustments to her behavior that seemed reasonable in isolation, but together began to reshape who she was. She stopped mentioning her college achievements because Marcus had a way of diminishing them with comments about how academic success didn't translate to real-world intelligence. She began dressing differently, not because Marcus demanded it, but because he had subtle ways of expressing disappointment when she wore things that were too casual, too professional, too anything that wasn't what he preferred in that moment. The friends who had known Sarah longest began to notice changes they couldn't quite articulate. Jessica, who had been Sarah's roommate in college, mentioned during a lunch that Sarah seemed to apologize more than she used to. When Jessica brought this up, Sarah laughed it off, explaining that she was just trying to be more considerate of others. But privately, the comment stuck with her. She started paying attention to her own words and realized Jessica was right. She had developed a habit of prefacing almost every statement with sorry, as if her thoughts were an imposition on the world around her. Sorry for being late when she arrived exactly on time. Sorry for suggesting a restaurant when asked where she wanted to eat. Sorry for having opinions that differed from Marcus's, even on topics as trivial as which movie to watch on a Friday night. The apologies had become so automatic that she barely noticed she was making them, but they represented something much deeper than politeness. They were evidence of a fundamental shift in how she saw her place in the world. Marcus had a gift for making Sarah feel simultaneously cherished and inadequate. He would surprise her with flowers on random Tuesdays, then spend the evening explaining how other men wouldn't put in that kind of effort for their girlfriends. He would cook elaborate dinners that showcased his culinary skills, then express disappointment when Sarah couldn't finish everything on her plate, suggesting that she didn't appreciate the work he had put in. He would plan romantic getaways that seemed designed more to prove his superiority as a boyfriend than to create shared memories. Every gesture of love came with an attached invoice that Sarah was expected to pay in gratitude, admiration, and increasingly in silence about the things that bothered her. When Sarah tried to express concerns about their relationship, Marcus had developed a sophisticated system of responses that left her feeling confused and guilty. If she mentioned feeling controlled, he would remind her of all the freedom he allowed her, listing the ways other men might restrict their girlfriends. If she said she felt unheard, he would point out how much time he spent listening to her problems, often mentioning that his ex-girlfriend had been much more independent and required less emotional support. The most insidious part of Marcus's emotional manipulation was how he convinced Sarah that her feelings were evidence of her own inadequacy rather than valid responses to his behavior. When she felt hurt by something he said, he would explain that she was being too sensitive, that her reaction was disproportionate to his innocent comment. When she felt confused by mixed messages, he would suggest that she was overthinking things, that her tendency to analyze everything was a character flaw that prevented her from simply enjoying their relationship. When she felt isolated from her friends, he would remind her that real love meant prioritizing their relationship above casual friendships, that her inability to understand this showed a lack of maturity in her approach to commitment. Over time, Sarah began to see herself through Marcus's eyes, and the reflection was of someone who was fundamentally flawed, someone who was lucky to be loved despite her many shortcomings. The woman who had once trusted her instincts learned to doubt every feeling, every thought, every impulse that didn't align with Marcus's version of reality. The isolation happened gradually, orchestrated with the precision of someone who understood exactly how to separate a person from their support system without appearing to do so deliberately. Marcus never forbade Sarah from seeing her friends, but he had perfected the art of making those interactions unpleasant enough that she began avoiding them on her own. When she made plans with Jessica, Marcus would become unusually needy, calling with emergencies that required her immediate attention or developing sudden illnesses that needed her care. When she went out with her work colleagues for happy hour, Marcus would spend the evening sending increasingly concerned texts about how late it was getting, how dangerous the area was where they were meeting, how worried he was about her safety. By the time Sarah returned home from any social gathering, she felt guilty for having enjoyed herself while Marcus was suffering in her absence. The easiest solution seemed to be to simply decline invitations, to prioritize Marcus's comfort over her own need for friendship and connection. Sarah's family had always been close, but they lived across the country, making regular contact more challenging even under normal circumstances. Marcus encouraged Sarah to be honest with them about her happiness, to share how fulfilled she was in their relationship. But somehow conversations with her mother and sister began to feel strained. When Sarah mentioned Marcus's thoughtfulness, she found herself exaggerating his positive qualities while minimizing incidents that might concern them. When they asked direct questions about her well-being, Sarah discovered she had developed an automatic response of reassurance that didn't quite ring true. The gap between her inner experience and the version of her life she presented to others grew wider with each phone call home. Her family sensed something was wrong but couldn't identify what it was, and Sarah became skilled at deflecting their concerns, with stories about work stress, city life challenges, and the general busyness that kept her from visiting as often as she used to. The truth was that Marcus had strong opinions about how much time and emotional energy Sarah should invest in family relationships that didn't include him, And it was easier to manage his reactions by limiting those connections than to constantly navigate his disapproval. At work, Sarah's confidence began to erode in ways that affected her professional performance. The woman who had once contributed creative ideas in brainstorming sessions became quiet during meetings, second-guessing every thought before deciding it wasn't worth sharing. When her supervisor praised a project she had led, Sarah found herself deflecting the compliment, listing all the ways the outcome could have been better. She had internalized Marcus's critical voice to such an extent that she heard his judgments even when he wasn't present. Colleagues who had once sought her input on challenging projects began to overlook her, not out of malice, but because she had become invisible in the way that people do when they stop advocating for themselves. Sarah told herself that being humble was a virtue, that seeking recognition was selfish, that her value wasn't dependent on external validation. But underneath these rationalizations, she knew something essential was slipping away from her, some core sense of her own worth that had once been as natural as breathing. The turning point came on a Thursday evening in late September when Sarah was preparing dinner in her kitchen, moving through the familiar routine of chopping vegetables and preparing Marcus's favorite meal. He was telling her about his day, describing a conflict with his boss that he had handled brilliantly, explaining how his co-workers failed to appreciate his insights, detailing the ways his ex-girlfriend had been more supportive during his career challenges. Sarah listened, making appropriate sounds of sympathy and encouragement when something inside her shifted. As she stood there, cutting carrots with mechanical precision, while Marcus recounted his grievances, Sarah suddenly saw herself as if from outside her own body. She saw a woman who had become smaller and smaller, who had learned to take up less space, to have fewer opinions, to need less attention. She saw someone who had traded her authentic self for the promise of being loved, only to discover that what she had found wasn't love at all, but a sophisticated form of emotional imprisonment. The realization didn't come with dramatic music or sudden clarity. Instead, it felt like waking up gradually from a long dream, becoming aware of reality in slow layers. Sarah finished preparing dinner, served it with the same careful attention to Marcus's preferences she had developed over 3 years, and listened as he critiqued the seasoning while simultaneously praising her effort. But something fundamental had shifted in her perception. For the first time in months, she found herself observing Marcus's behavior with the detachment of someone seeing clearly. She noticed how he interrupted her when she tried to speak, how he corrected her recollection of events they had both experienced, how he presented his opinions as facts while treating her thoughts as evidence of confusion. She realized that this had become the pattern of their every interaction, that she had adapted so completely to his need for dominance that she had forgotten what it felt like to have her own perspective validated. That night, after Marcus had fallen asleep beside her, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling and remembering who she used to be. She thought about the college student who had started a campus organization for environmental awareness, who had given presentations to audiences of hundreds without fear, who had believed her voice mattered enough to use it. She remembered the young professional who had negotiated her first salary increase with confidence, who had ended a previous relationship when it no longer served her growth, who had trusted her instincts about people and situations. She thought about the friend who had been known for her laugh, for her curiosity about the world, for her ability to make others feel seen and valued. That woman felt like someone from another lifetime, someone Sarah had betrayed through tiny compromises that had accumulated into a complete surrender of self. The grief she felt was not just for her current situation, but for all the moments she had failed to honor her own worth, all the times she had chosen peace over truth, all the ways she had made herself smaller to make Marcus feel larger. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in over a year. After Marcus left for his job, she sat in the silence of her apartment and tried to remember what her own voice sounded like when she wasn't modifying it for someone else's comfort. She made herself coffee the way she preferred it, not the way Marcus insisted was better. She put on music she enjoyed, not the classical compositions Marcus believed demonstrated superior taste. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to simply exist without an audience, without the constant internal commentary about whether her choices were correct, appropriate, or likely to meet with approval. The experience was both liberating and terrifying because it forced her to confront how thoroughly she had abandoned herself in the pursuit of a relationship that demanded her disappearance as the price of admission. Sarah spent that day going through old photo albums, reading journals from before she had met Marcus, reconnecting with aspects of herself that had gone dormant. She looked at pictures of herself from 2 years earlier and saw a woman with bright eyes and genuine smiles, someone who looked comfortable in her own skin. She read entries about dreams she had forgotten, goals she had set aside, observations about life that revealed a mind engaged with the world around her. The contrast between that woman and who she had become was stark enough to break something open inside her chest. She cried for the first time in months, not the careful tears she had learned to shed quietly so as not to burden Marcus with her emotions, but deep sobs that seemed to come from some place that had been locked away for too long. The crying felt like a form of mourning, grieving the person she had been and the time she had lost pretending to be someone else. When Marcus returned home that evening, he was immediately suspicious of Sarah's mood. She seemed different in a way he couldn't identify, less attuned to his needs, less immediately available for the kind of attention he had come to expect. When he asked about her day, she gave brief answers instead of the detailed recounting he preferred. When he began his usual litany of complaints about work, she listened without the engaged responses that typically encouraged him to continue. The shift was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had become accustomed to being the center of Sarah's emotional universe. Marcus's reaction was swift and predictable. He accused Sarah of being distant, of not caring about his feelings, of becoming selfish and inconsiderate. He reminded her of his stress levels, his need for support, the ways other women would be grateful for a man who was as committed to their relationship as he was. But instead of the familiar spiral of guilt and apology this usually triggered, Sarah found herself listening to his words with new ears. For the first time, she heard the manipulation clearly, saw the way Marcus used her love for him as a weapon against her autonomy. She recognized the pattern of emotional blackmail that had become so normalized she had stopped noticing it. When he accused her of not caring, she realized she had been caring too much, to the point of self-destruction. When he called her selfish, she understood that he was really saying she was insufficiently focused on his needs. When he threatened to withdraw his affection if she didn't return to her previous level of accommodation, she felt something that had been dormant for months stirring back to life. It was anger, clean and justified, at being asked to betray herself as proof of her love. The anger felt foreign after so many months of turning every conflict inward, of assuming that relationship problems were evidence of her own inadequacy. But it also felt like coming home to a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. Sarah didn't confront Marcus that night. She was too newly awakened to trust her ability to navigate such a crucial conversation, too aware of how skilled he was at turning her words against her. Instead, she began the quiet work of remembering who she was and what she needed. She started reaching out to friends she had neglected, not with dramatic declarations about her relationship troubles, but with simple invitations to reconnect. She called Jessica and suggested lunch, not to unburden herself, but to remember what it felt like to have conversations that weren't centered on managing someone else's emotions. She signed up for a pottery class she had mentioned wanting to take before Marcus had explained why it was a waste of time and money. She began reading books that interested her, not just the ones Marcus recommended as intellectually worthwhile. Each small act of self-reclamation felt like rebellion and homecoming simultaneously. The changes in Sarah were gradual enough that she might have convinced herself she was imagining them, but Marcus's increasing agitation confirmed that something fundamental was shifting. He began working harder to regain the control that had once been effortless, oscillating between extra charm and heightened criticism. One evening, he would surprise her with an expensive dinner, reminding her of how thoughtful he was compared to other men. The next evening, he would critique her appearance, her conversation skills, her inability to appreciate the effort he put into their relationship. What Marcus couldn't understand was that Sarah was developing something that had been absent for too long: the ability to observe his behavior without immediately internalizing it as commentary on her worth. She was learning to see his reactions as information about him rather than instructions for how she should change. The converse she had booked, he questioned Sarah no to the word he s she was when she explained that being in a relationship meant choosing each other daily, not controlling each other constantly. She said that she had spent so long trying to be the woman he wanted that she had forgotten who she actually was, and that the journey back to herself was not negotiable. Marcus responded with a mixture of charm and threat, promising to be more supportive while simultaneously warning her about the consequences of throwing away a relationship with someone who had invested so much in her happiness. But Sarah had reached a place where Marcus's approval was no longer the center of her emotional universe, and his disapproval no longer felt like a crisis requiring immediate resolution. She told him that their relationship had become toxic for both of them, that they had created a dynamic where his emotional needs could only be met by her emotional diminishment, and that she couldn't continue to participate in that exchange. When Marcus accused her of being dramatic, of giving up on them without trying to work things out, Sarah explained that she had been trying to work things out for months by changing herself, and that she was finally ready to try a different approach. The approach of honoring her own worth, of insisting on relationships that enhanced rather than diminished her authentic self, of choosing growth over comfort and truth over peace. The breakup was not clean or simple because Marcus was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully. He alternated between begging Sarah to reconsider and punishing her for her decision. He promised to change while simultaneously explaining why her expectations were unrealistic. He reminded her of all the ways he had supported her while listing all the ways she had failed to appreciate him. He threatened to tell their mutual friends about her emotional instability while promising to always love her despite her inability to commit to their relationship. But something had shifted so fundamentally in Sarah that Marcus's words no longer carried the power to reshape her reality. She had remembered what it felt like to trust her own perceptions, to believe her own experiences, to honor her own needs. The woman who had once apologized for existing was learning to take up space again. Moving forward was not a simple process of walking away from Marcus and immediately reclaiming her former self. Sarah had to rebuild her identity gradually, learning to distinguish between the voice of her authentic self and the internalized criticism that had become second nature during their relationship. She had to practice making decisions based on the work was harder than she had anticipated because she realized how thoroughly Marcus's influence had permeated her sense of self. Even after he was no longer physically present in her life, she found herself mentally seeking his approval for choices both large and small. Therapy became an essential part of Sarah's healing process, not because she was broken, but because she needed help understanding how she had lost herself so completely and how to prevent it from happening again. Her therapist helped her see the patterns that had made her vulnerable to Marcus's manipulation, the childhood lessons about love requiring sacrifice that had prepared her to accept emotional abuse as evidence of commitment. Together, they worked on developing what her therapist called emotional boundaries, the ability to remain connected to others without losing connection to herself. Sarah learned to recognize the difference between compromise, which was healthy in relationships, and self-betrayal, which was not. She practiced saying no to small requests so that she could access that strength when facing larger violations of her autonomy. The friends Sarah had distanced herself from during her relationship with Marcus welcomed her back with a grace that humbled her. They didn't demand explanations for her absence or make her grovel for their forgiveness. Instead, they simply made space for her to return to herself at her own pace. Jessica, who had known Sarah the longest, was especially patient as Sarah relearned how to be in relationships that didn't require constant management of someone else's emotions. During one of their weekly coffee dates, Jessica mentioned how good it was to see Sarah's laugh again, to hear her express opinions without immediately qualifying them, to watch her take up space in conversations instead of shrinking to accommodate everyone else. These observations meant more to Sarah than Jessica could know because they confirmed that the changes she felt internally were visible to people who cared about her. Sarah's family was relieved to have their daughter and sister back, even though they never fully understood what had happened during those 3 years. Her mother noticed immediately that Sarah sounded different on their phone calls, more present and engaged, more like the woman she remembered raising. When Sarah finally visited home for the first time since the early days of her relationship with Marcus, her sister commented on how much lighter she seemed, how her smile reached her eyes again. They didn't pry into the details of what had gone wrong with Marcus, sensing that Sarah would share what she was ready to share when she was ready to share it. Their unconditional acceptance reminded Sarah of what healthy love looked like, love that enhanced rather than diminished, that supported growth rather than demanded conformity. At work, Sarah began to reclaim the professional confidence that had once been her trademark. She started speaking up in meetings again, contributing ideas that her colleagues valued. When her supervisor offered her a promotion that would involve more leadership responsibilities, Sarah accepted without the lengthy internal debate about whether she was qualified that had characterized her decision-making during the Marcus years. She realized that her worth wasn't dependent on external validation, but that didn't mean external recognition was meaningless. It meant she could receive acknowledgement of her capabilities without needing it to define her, and she could pursue challenges without needing guaranteed success to justify the attempt. The promotion brought new responsibilities that Sarah embraced with an enthusiasm she had forgotten she possessed. 6 months after ending her relationship with Marcus, Sarah met David at a workshop about sustainable living practices. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours and covered everything from climate change to childhood memories to their shared love of obscure documentaries. What struck Sarah immediately was how David listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but actually engaging with her thoughts and building on her ideas. When she expressed an opinion, he asked follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity about her perspective. When they disagreed about something, he explored the difference with interest rather than trying to convince her she was wrong. By the end of their first coffee date, Sarah realized she had spent 3 hours being completely herself, and David seemed to like her more rather than less because of it. Dating David was a revelation for Sarah because it showed her what healthy relationship dynamics looked like in practice rather than just in theory. David was interested in her thoughts, her feelings, her experiences, not as materials to be shaped for his purposes, but as windows into who she was as a person. He encouraged her pottery hobby. Even though he had no particular interest in ceramics himself, he enjoyed meeting her friends without trying to monopolize her time with them. He shared his own vulnerabilities and challenges without expecting Sarah to solve them or take responsibility for his emotional well-being. When they had conflicts, which they did like any normal couple, David approached them as problems to be solved together rather than competitions to be won. He never made Sarah feel like her needs were inconvenient or her feelings were excessive. The contrast between her relationship with David and her relationship with Marcus was so stark that Sarah sometimes wondered if she was idealizing David or minimizing the problems they faced together. But her therapist helped her understand that what felt unusual was actually normal, that healthy relationships were characterized by mutual respect, emotional safety, and the kind of love that expanded rather than contracted each person's sense of self. Sarah had become so accustomed to dysfunction that function felt foreign, but that didn't make it less real or valuable. Learning to accept genuine care without waiting for the other shoe to drop became part of Sarah's ongoing healing process. She had to practice believing that she deserved to be loved for who she was rather than who she could become if she changed everything about herself. 2 years later, Sarah reflected on her journey during the workshop she had started facilitating for women recovering from emotionally abusive relationships. standing before a group of 15 women whose stories echoed her own in different keys. Sarah felt the weight of how far she had travelled from the woman who had once apologised for taking up space. She shared her story not as someone who had overcome all her challenges, but as someone who had learned that healing was an ongoing process. That strength was not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to remain open despite the risks. She talked about the importance of trusting their own perceptions, of seeking relationships that enhanced rather than diminished their authentic selves, of remembering that love should feel like freedom rather than imprisonment. One of the women in the group, Maria, stayed after the session to thank Sarah for her honesty about how gradual the manipulation had been, how normal it had seemed while it was happening. Maria was in the early stages of recognizing that her own relationship was toxic, and she expressed fear about whether she was strong enough to leave, whether she could survive on her own, whether anyone would ever love her, if she stopped being the accommodating woman her boyfriend preferred. Sarah recognized her former self in Maria's words and was able to offer something she had desperately needed during her own dark period: the reassurance that she was not crazy, that her feelings were valid, that she possessed more strength than she knew. Sarah told Maria that the woman who was brave enough to attend these workshops was already demonstrating the courage that would carry her through whatever came next. Watching Maria and the other women in the group begin their own journeys toward emotional freedom reminded Sarah of how far she had come, not just in terms of leaving Marcus, but in terms of rebuilding her relationship with herself. She had learned to trust her instincts again, to value her own opinions, to take up space without apology. She had surrounded herself with people who celebrated her authentic self rather than trying to reshape her for their comfort. She had found work that utilized her skills and relationships that nourished her spirit. Most importantly, she had learned the difference between being loved for who she pretended to be and being loved for who she actually was. The journey from self-betrayal to self-reclamation had been longer and more challenging than she had anticipated, but it had also been more rewarding than she had dared to hope. As Sarah prepared to leave the community center where the workshop had taken place, she took a moment to appreciate the woman she had become. She was not perfect or completely healed, but she was whole, in a way that had nothing to do with being in a relationship with someone else. She had learned that her worth was not dependent on external validation, that her voice mattered even when others disagreed with it, that her needs were legitimate even when they inconvenienced others. She had discovered that real love enhanced rather than diminished, supported rather than controlled, celebrated rather than criticized. The shadow she had carried for so long, the internalized voice that told her she was too much and not enough simultaneously, had not disappeared completely, but had lost its power to define her reality. Sarah's story is one of millions, told in different details but sharing common themes of lost identity and reclaimed strength. It reminds us that healing is possible, that we are not doomed to repeat patterns that no longer serve us, that it is never too late to choose growth over comfort, authenticity over approval, self-love over self-betrayal.